about that. She's like, we could leave it.
Okay, Laura, would you mind posting on the Facebook
Sure.
post I made that will be live on YouTube?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay. And I could even drop the link in for folks.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that. Every time I think I've got all this technology figured out, they change something.
July can't come fast enough.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Every time I think I've got all this technology figured out.
Oh, I hear you.
Yeah, I don't know. I must
July
be somewhere.
can't come fast enough.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Every time does somebody have it on? Or do you have the YouTube up, Laura?
I hear you.
Yeah. No.
No, I'm muted, so it's someone else.
Does somebody have it on? Or do you have the YouTube up, Laura? No. Okay, it's not me. Does somebody have the YouTube up or?
No, I've got you on YouTube.
Oh, okay. Well,
That might be it.
does somebody have the YouTube up or?
No, I've got you on YouTube.
Okay, well, all right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen here with the.
Do you want us all to mute for right now?
Yeah, why don't we do that just so that. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. All right, it went away. Good. Great. Can you all see a big flaming bush?
Yes. Yes.
Good. That's what I was looking for. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for Bible study. I'm excited to explore the 10 Commandments with you, at least the second half. We're most of the way done now. We just have 2 more weeks. So next week we'll talk about the golden calf. And the following week, we'll talk a little bit about it's a really pivotal scene in Exodus, in Exodus 34, where after the people have broken the covenant is renewed. So it's a really, really kind of powerful scene. And then we'll be done with this study of Exodus. So, we're looking at some things to do maybe through the summer, maybe through the fall. We're just kind of checking things out. Some of that has to do with me figuring out vacation schedules and such. But we may do some, maybe a book study on an anti-racist book or something to get us to kind of do some work around racism and that sort of thing. So that's kind of where my mind's going right now. So today we're wrapping up 10 Commandments. And this is a slide I showed you last week. The first 3 commandments are really focused on our relationship with God. The second 6, so 5 through 10 are really focused on our relationship with one another. And the 4th commandment is kind of serves as a sort of bridge in between the 2. That commandment connects to our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. And so we're going to be focusing on this second half, commandments 4 through 10 today. So the book had some really good reading. So if you've been following along in our book, again, it's a wonderful little book. There's some really great information in here. One of the things I found most helpful when thinking about the fourth commandment is that the commandment is not necessarily to rest on the Sabbath day, which is what we usually think of when we think of Sabbath, is a time of rest. But the literal word in Hebrew is to cease, to stop. And it's connected to God's actions at creation. And the thing that the author and several commentators point out is resting is not a great word for what's being asked of us, because God did not rest after creating, because God doesn't get tired. God stopped because it was complete and perfect, and God then stopped to enjoy what had been created. And I actually think there's something a little powerful about that. And I think it gives a little bit more direction to our Sabbath day observance, that it's not just about resting for a day. It's about taking the time to enjoy the life that God has made for us and the world that God has made for us. Had any of you ever run into that way of thinking of Sabbath before? Okay, in what ways is it helpful or maybe not helpful for you?
I think it gives me permission, because I feel guilty because I've heard it that, oh, you're supposed to rest, you're not supposed to do anything. So then I feel guilty if I do anything, or if I'm doing something I enjoy, am I being disrespectful? So by putting it that way, I'm enjoying these gifts from God. I'm doing what he wants me to do. And I don't have to, it's guilt-free, no side of guilt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it makes more sense to take that day to worship God and honor God. Consider it a holy day.
Yeah. I think one of the problems with thinking of Sabbath as our day of rest is it sort of gives us permission to run ourselves ragged the rest of the week, right? Like resting, that's for Sunday. The rest of the week. And part of what I've been finding in my own thinking of Sabbath is, no, I've got to build rest into the rest of my week so that I can really enjoy life and enjoy creation on Sunday. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Like if I'm so tired at the end of the week that I can't even take the time to enjoy life, like what? That's not the life God wants for us. Yeah. Laura, have you frozen? I think we lost Laura. Because it looked like she was going to say something and then her screen froze. So yeah. There's some suggestion in some of the writing, especially the Jewish writing, that this fourth commandment is the key to following through on all of the rest of the commandments. So not only is it sort of the bridge between honoring God and being in relationship with each other, but it's also essential to keep Sabbath in order to have the energy to do the other 9 of the 10 commandments. And I see some merit to that idea. It's hard to honor your parents. It's hard to honor God. It's hard to follow through on the rest of those things when you're exhausted and you're not enjoying the life you have. That tends to make you a bitter person. And so, and bitterness can lead to all kinds of problems. And so the idea that Sabbath is a part of what we need in life, I think is really important. When I was in college, there was a scholarship where you could earn, I think it was $1,000 or $1,500 if you would memorize one of the early confessions of the church. It was called the Westminster Confession. I did not win that scholarship. I did not memorize it all, but I do remember the first one. And the first question was, what is the chief end of humanity? Like, what is the purpose of humanity? Why did God create us? And the answer to that question in this confession was to love God and enjoy God forever. Like, that's what we were built for, was to enjoy God. And I think that's really what's behind Sabbath. Like, the goal of Sabbath is to enjoy God and what God does. Part of that is creating, in the act of creation. Part of it is God's care for us, God's providence. But Sabbath is the time when we enjoy God and we live into our purpose. We're supposed to do that all the time, but Sabbath is our time to remember that. That is why we exist, and to give God God's due if we haven't been doing it the rest of the week. So, yeah, good. So the next commandment, the fifth commandment, is to honor your parents, honor your father and mother. And this is key because in ancient Israelite society, the family, the extended family, was the kind of the bedrock, the foundation of society. Your family was everything. Family took care of each other. There were no court systems as we imagine them today. Was everything. And so family took care of each other. There were no, I think, court systems as we imagine them today. Was everything. Did somebody unmute here? Family took care of each other. There we go. I like listening to myself, but not like that. So yeah, honoring your parents was important because your parents ordered the life of the family. They made sure everyone got along, and especially the male head of household. That was the one who would defend you in the courts. There were no lawyers. You couldn't hire somebody to represent you. It was your male head of household. And so honoring your parents was about keeping society in working order and not devolving into chaos. It's also just a good thing to do. Your parents invest a lot in you. And your parents give up and sacrifice a lot for you. Part of honoring your parents is recognizing all that they have done for you. Yeah. In our modern era, we don't tend to consider age something to be proud of. There's a lot of, especially not when you think of like Asian cultures where our elders are highly respected. Ancient Israelite culture was much more similar to those, in that those who are older than you, your elders are to be highly respected because they are wise and they know the ways of the world, they know the ways of God, and so you listen to them, even when they give you advice that you don't like, because they know, they've been around the block, so to speak. Was there anything else you all appreciated about the commandment to honor your father and mother, either from the book, or even if it's just something you've always appreciated about that or struggled with that commandment?
I think it's the easiest commandment to hold.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not an easy one to follow, especially in this day and age. Yeah. I was reading an article about that actually, that American culture has kind of fallen in love with youth. We value youth. Some of it is because of our ideals around beauty, but also it connects to the fact that in American culture, it's all about success and achievement and productivity, and those who are young are more likely to overwork, and so um, American culture has come to value youth over age, um, and and there's some problems with that, and I think some of those problems we're seeing in our world today. Um, so there are some benefits to that too. Investing in young people and raising them up well, but like anything, when you make a big shift in society, there are good things and bad things about that happen. So the next few commandments, and that's the 6, 7, sorry, 8 and 9 and 10. In Hebrew, they're actually only 2 words, and I tried to kind of convey that in the English on the slides here. So it's the word no and then murder. No murder. And this is a really interesting commandment because on face value, it just seems simple, right? Don't kill people. And yet, when we move beyond the 10 commandments to the rest of the laws, there are all kinds of reasons why someone might be killed because of the legal system, right? They might be executed, stoned to death, or whatever. So the some English translations say, "Thou shalt not kill." Others they say, "Thou shalt not murder." Murder is the more accurate according to the Hebrew, and murder is premeditated, and it's for one's own gain. So Hebrew law had provisions for self-defense, for example. What is being prohibited is murdering someone else, and one of the ways I like to think of the Hebrew thought around this is that the 10 Commandments and the Hebrew Bible in general demands that there be no unnecessary suffering at the end of life, that there be no unnecessary killing, which leads to a bit of an ethical conundrum. What is an ethical reason to kill? And scripture wrestles with this, and people of faith wrestle with this. Is execution okay if someone breaks the law? Is that a necessary killing to maintain order and to punish crimes and to fulfill justice? Is the death penalty okay? People of faith wrestle with that. Another big wrestling around the sixth commandment is just war. Is it ever okay to go to war? Would God ever bless war? People of faith and Christians argue about that all the time. So some of the early church fathers, like Augustine, said, yeah, there are reasons why a Christian nation or Christian people might go to war. His reasons were pretty narrow. It had to be in defense of someone else, and you could not gain from it in any way. So, so Christians debated a lot around the war in Iraq, and particularly the Gulf War, about whether those were just wars. Were we really, the Gulf War where we were defending Kuwait? A lot of folks argued that was all about oil, protecting our oil supply. So we were getting something out of that. So was it really just? This sixth commandment is, it seems easy on the face of it, but it gets complex pretty quick. Many folks who don't eat meat, many vegans, point to this commandment: "Thou shalt not kill." Were you going to say something, Laura? Oh, sorry. I saw your mouth moving.
Yelling at my children, sorry.
It's okay.
One of the other things I think this brings up is wars of conquest.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't this interesting? In the Christian faith, we had crusades, and that seems to fly directly in the face of this commandment. Yeah. It's interesting that the Jewish people conquered territory, and this didn't seem to bother them. Throughout the history of Israel, at the time of King David, King Solomon, the kingdom of Israel was most of the Levant, the area between Mesopotamia and Egypt. They didn't seem to have problems with this prohibition against killing there. So, but many modern Christians really see this as a command to honor life, if that makes sense. Life is valuable because God made it. And so don't snuff it out unnecessarily. And if the commandment is not just to not murder, but in the positive sense to honor life, our job is to make life enjoyable for as many people as possible. Yeah, Liana?
There's many wars in the Old Testament where God directed them. He led them. He even had the Ark of the Covenant there protecting them.
Yeah. Yeah, and those passages are some of the most difficult for Christians to figure out what to do with. Megan teaches a class at Whitworth called Bible for Doubters, and they spent a whole class on that, 4 hours, because it's really complex. Go ahead, Laura.
I was just going to say, it just reminds me of being a child growing up in Christian churches, singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers." That was one of our regular songs.
Yeah, and that's a real problem. That part of Scripture is really hard for us, I think. And there are different ways that people of faith try and read those passages and understand them. I personally find none of them entirely satisfying. They're just hard. They're not easy texts to read and figure out. Yeah. So, because it's interesting, if any nation these days claimed God was telling them to conquer someone else, the world would go nuts. And in fact, there are some people, some religions that claim that now, and none of us buy it. So why did it work then? That's the question. We don't know. So the next commandment is "Thou shalt not commit adultery," no adultery. And interestingly enough, again, this is about the family system and protecting the family system from devolving into chaos. If our families aren't there, to keep order and protect each other, then anyone is vulnerable. It is also particularly targeted towards protecting women and children. Interestingly enough, the Bible does address divorce, particularly in the New Testament. And there, Jesus says that divorce was something created for man, that God did not desire that. And it was pretty one-sided. A man would go to the gate where the elders sat, and he would write out a writ of divorce and give it to the woman, and then the wedding was over, or the marriage was over. A woman couldn't ask for that. And actually at the time, this was even fairly progressive, because in many cultures, a husband could just kick the woman out the door. there wasn't even paperwork. So this was definitely a little better than other cultures around Israel, but not great. And so this commandment to not commit adultery is designed to help protect marriages and families from falling into chaos.
How does that work when you have a culture that is allowing multiple wives? How is that not committing?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Because if you marry him, you're not committing adultery?
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, isn't that partly because women were more of a chattel than a person? And so it almost makes it like committing adultery was like stealing somebody else's property, their wife.
Yeah, because women were property.
Yeah, and marriages were more like contracts between families, if that makes sense. And so really, and sadly, it's almost more about, and mostly about, keeping your agreements, keeping your promises. So there were definitely some downsides to being a woman in the ancient world, or being a child. In many cultures, Israel included, children weren't even really considered people until they'd reached the age of about 8, because children died so easily. And so, they were there, but you didn't grow attached to them yet, because they could very likely die. So this command about not committing adultery these days in the modern era is about being careful about relationships outside of your marriage, right? And I remember in seminary talking about the fact that adultery can occur in many forms. There's sexual adultery, but there's also emotional adultery, where you become emotionally more attached to someone who is not your wife or your husband. And so in our modern context, it's still about an agreement. It's about the agreement between not two families, but two people. And the agreement is to cling to each other, to love each other above anyone else. And adultery is in our modern context become breaking that promise, which to me is not a stretch, actually. I feel like it's a good parallel analogy to what was being asked of us in the ancient world. Yeah. Are there any other comments around this commandment? Anything from the book you found helpful?
One of the things that I think about is the sanctity of the family in that time. Like we studied in Ruth, that you didn't want to stir up the family by sleeping with your brother's wife or preferring his wife over yours, because that disturbed the whole family setup.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and those family connections were very important. And like in the story of Ruth, you did everything you could to avoid offending someone, because if the family is divided, then the family's weak and can't protect its members as well. And so we all go out of our way to not offend family members. Yeah, yeah,
And even today, adultery, whether it's physical or emotional, disturbs the family too. So it
yeah,
disrupts it.
yeah, definitely. Um, yes. I want to speak a little bit more to Melva, the thing you brought up, that families looked a lot different back in the day. um, you know, it, the idea that we often have that the Bible teaches the same sort of marriage that we have today is just kind of false. In the ancient world, people regularly have multiple wives. Um, People regularly have wives and concubines or female slaves. Or like there were so many different relationships going on back in the ancient world. Um, King Solomon is famous for having hundreds of wives, and that's seen as a negative thing, not because of the marriages, but because of the political alliances, if that makes sense. He had many wives, which was dangerous because that meant that he had too many commitments outside of Israel. So it was not about the wives per se, it was about the agreements he'd made. So um, it's just, I think, important for us to recognize that um, the Bible has a very different picture of marriage than we do today. Uh, and you know, in our modern day, this is starting to break down a little bit. For a period of time, the church was really the body that defined marriage and made marriages happen. You know, pastors had to do that. But for most of the biblical period, that was a civil thing, not a religious thing, if that makes sense. So the state did that. You know, we don't have any examples in the Bible of priests presiding over weddings or anything like that. We just don't read about that. So they're not mentioned at all, which is interesting because today as a pastor, I feel like if you're not a member of my church, probably the most likely thing you'll want from me is for me to marry you. And I just find that fascinating, that's become what pastors are known for in our context now. Yeah. All right. Let's go on to the eighth commandment, which is about no stealing. And I don't know if you caught this if you were reading in the book, but again, this was perhaps originally an injunction against stealing other people or kidnapping. But at least as we have it now, it's against theft of personal property. And this commandment acknowledges a reality of the ancient world, and that is that theft was a major problem, just like it is today. I don't know if you are a part of any neighborhood groups on Facebook, but the one in my neighborhood, that's what probably half the posts are about. Somebody stole this from my backyard. Somebody stole this from my front porch. Theft is still a major problem. It was hard to accumulate property in the ancient world. People didn't have a lot of stuff. And so when something of yours was taken, you knew it, and it was a big deal. And so, interestingly enough, I think of my kids. When something of theirs goes missing, the first thing they think of is this: somebody stole it. And we do that too. I think that's human nature. And again, theft can become a major dividing force within any community or family. And so this prohibition against theft, again, I think again, is aimed at making sure the community, making sure the family sticks together and holds together and isn't divided. So it's a pretty simple commandment, but I think it's maybe the one we accuse people of breaking the most. Anyone else have something to say about stealing? Did any of your kids accuse others of stealing?
I don't remember anything like that, but you touched on something that struck me, and that is in the biblical times, they didn't have a lot of things. And now we do, generally speaking. I remember when I was a kid, and in the older homes, closets were 4 feet long. That was it, because you didn't have 100 pieces of wardrobe. So people it's just been in the last 50 or 60 years that this having tons and tons of stuff has really happened in our society, I think.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing where that takes us too. The Marie Kondo stuff. There's a move to simplify life now and get rid of stuff. Yeah. Yana, did you have something to add?
Oh, I was just thinking storage wars on TV.
That's right.
You have this big mansion house, and then you have to have storage sheds outside, and then you still have to rent storage from someplace else to hold it all.
Yeah.
This does not compute.
Yeah. Megan and I have lived now here in Spokane in the parsonage for longer than we've lived anywhere. And we are amazed at how much stuff we've accumulated. And one of our big projects for the summer is to clear out some stuff and give it away or sell it just to simplify life. Yeah.
Yeah, being in the military, you didn't accumulate quite as much. You noticed when you got out, how slowly, it went to storage shed.
That's right. Well, yeah, and Megan and I have moved every 4 years until we came to Audubon. And so all of a sudden we've been here actually 7 years here soon. And we have a lot of stuff. We also got kids. They brought their stuff too. So
Yeah.
So you can imagine what it's like when you live somewhere 45 years.
yeah, I can't imagine. Wow.
Jeff,
Yes.
I think value is something that we haven't talked about on these items that people have.
Yep.
And I think today a lot of the looting and that kind of thing is because they never had anything of value. They didn't realize what it means to take something from somebody.
So yeah, I want to speak to this in relation to the 10 Commandments, and it was on my things to talk about at the end, but we can talk about it now. A lot of the folks involved in rioting and looting, what they are saying is that those in authority have broken the social contract. Have you heard that language? Social contract?
Mm-hmm.
That comes back to the 10 Commandments. That's essentially what the 10 Commandments are. Is there a social contract, especially the second half? This is how we will be together in community. God gave us these rules, and we will follow them. And basic to almost any social contract is the idea of not killing, especially not killing unjustly. And so many folks involved in the Black Lives Movement or other movements for racial justice are saying, you broke the social contract, you are killing us, so I'm not going to follow your rules. I don't. You can agree with that argument or not, but that's the argument, and it goes back to these 10 commandments. Isn't that fascinating?
I think as far as that argument goes, I think it goes back to two wrongs don't make it right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I get that. I've also been trying really hard in this season to listen to African American voices who are saying, yes, but nothing else has worked. Like we've tried everything else. Like we've tried all the proper ways of stopping the killing, and they're not working. So this is what we're left with. At least that's what I'm hearing from African American voices that I'm trying to listen to. So
one of the other things I've heard is that because of the systemic racism, there's a large portion of our population who has nothing because, because of job availability and poor education and all of those things. And that by looting is about the only way they ever have of getting anything.
Yeah. Also, at least in my experience, looting is being done by folks on the fringes, not by the folks in leadership. And anytime there's chaos, there are folks who are opportunistic and take advantage of the situation. Most of the organizers I've been listening to have been trying to explain why that's happening and also say, but we're not the ones doing it. Martin Luther King Jr., his name's been thrown around a lot, and his name's thrown out anytime there's racial injustice. He said that rioting is the language of the unheard. When folks don't feel like they are being listened to, and that's what happens, is basically what King said. Yeah. Good. Good. So I want to honor our time, and we might come back to that a little bit if we have a little more time, but we have 2 more commandments. So the 9th commandment is against bearing false witness. We talked a little bit about this one last week, but in Hebrew society, doing what you say you're going to do and telling the truth were bedrocks, again, of society, just like the family. And so lying in court was considered a very heinous crime. And there were strong punishments for it in most ancient cultures. They didn't have video cameras that could go back and double check whether somebody was telling the truth. There wasn't a lot of, paperwork running around. You couldn't look for documents to find the truth. All you had was people's word. And so when people break their word and lie, especially in a legal setting, that was hugely problematic. And God, this is one of these commandments that God really takes up again and again and again. Most of these commandments occur elsewhere in the law, but this is one of the 10 commandments that is lifted up again and again by the prophets, bearing false witness in the court, because when this happens in the ancient world, it's only the rich that can get away with it. And the poor are the ones that suffer when lies happen in legal settings. And so the prophets railed against this because the poor suffer in the legal systems when the truth is not told. And so this is an interesting part of the Israelite social contract where God says again and again throughout the Old Testament, if there are those who do not have family to protect them, widows, orphans, strangers, if there are folks who do not have the resources to protect themselves because they're poor, God says again and again, essentially, I will be their family and I will protect them. So treat them right. Don't lie in court. This is a big deal. Trying to remember if there's anything else I needed to lift up. Anyone else have comments or questions about this 9th commandment?
Yeah, I think of all the fake news we have today, and it's getting to the point that you don't know whether you can trust what you read or not. You have to research it to find out if it's true, and it fosters conspiracy theories and everything else. Much of the conflict we have now is because of that.
Yeah, I think some of what we're seeing in the world today is what happens when truth is, dissolved, when truth breaks down and you don't know what is true. Yeah. And people now say whatever they need to say to win the day. Yeah, that's what's happening now. Yeah. And one of the things I think, one of the consequences of this is it's really hard to be a person of faith and to want to live righteously in a world where it's hard to tell what is true. It's hard to make decisions based on the facts when we don't know what the facts are. Yeah. Yeah. And there's no easy answer for navigating that. Yeah. Good. The 10th commandment is about coveting. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. And it's interesting that this commandment, many scholars point to the fact that this deals with the motivations for or the temptations to break the 8th commandment against stealing and the 7th commandment against adultery. Coveting is about desiring something that is not yours, longing for something that you don't own. Interestingly enough, it's been broadened even more in the scholarship and in theology to say it's about longing for things that you should not have also. So, so one way to think about it is thinking about other things as though they will make your life whole. Does that make sense? So we are very often think, if I can just get this thing, maybe it's a new car, maybe it's a new house, or it might be a relationship, right? If I can just get married, or if I can just have kids, then I'll feel like life is complete.
Right.
It's also closely related to greed.
Yeah. Yeah, greed is covetedness. I don't know the word. Greed is coveting like out of control, right? It's coming to the place where you have to consume more and more, or accumulate more and more, and it becomes a pattern in your life. Trying to fill that hole, and a lot of the scholarship has said that really coveting other things or other people is about our soul's longing for God and trying to satisfy that longing with other things and other people. St. Augustine famously said, our souls are restless until they rest in thee, O God. And it's this idea that what we really need to satisfy our longing and make us whole is a relationship with God. And coveting is trying to long for things other than God and thinking that they will satisfy our longing. The medieval scholars used to believe that pride was the root of all sin. And pride is thinking basically that we can make life on our own, that we can do life on our own, and we don't need God's help. And that gets us into all kinds of trouble. But I personally think that this might actually be the root of all evil. It's trying to satisfy our longing with God for anything other than God. Really leads to problems. We don't need to, tell stories now, but I think all of us could tell stories of when longing for something and trying to achieve something got us in trouble. Yeah. Any other comments or questions about coveting? Okay. So this last commandment is a great bridge to where I want to go next, because as the book says, coveting really leads in the direction that Jesus goes when it comes to following the law, right? Jesus says it's not so much about our actions. It is that, but it's also about what's in our hearts. That you can break the law in your heart without actually doing something wrong. And so in the New Testament, Jesus talks a lot about intentions and what's going on in our hearts. That if you want to get sin under control, that's where you have to start. You have to get your heart right. So the 10 Commandments, the Old Testament considers these, and so does the New Testament, sort of the heart of the law. And all of the rest of Torah, all the rest of the law, is kind of a jumping off, a working out of the implications of these 10 basic commandments. And it's interesting, we in the church, we are Christians, have been influenced a lot by Paul, who writes a lot about the law, often in very negative terms, right? Paul contrasts the law versus grace, right? When I was under the law, this was the way things were, but now that I know Jesus and now that I know grace, I know a new way. And Paul was doing that. He was contrasting those two things to try and get folks to realize the power of the grace of God and how much better a life it is. But I want us to be careful because Jews do not consider the law like an onerous list of rules the way we Christians do. In fact, Jews consider the law grace. God gave us the law to show us how to live, and that's a gift of grace. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So while Paul contrasts the two, in Jewish thought, the law is a gift of grace because it allows us to have a relationship with God, and it allows us to be in better relationship with each other. What Paul does and what Jesus does in the New Testament is he says, basically, you've perverted the law and you've made it all about these outward actions, and you've come to find ways where you can keep the law, the letter of the law, and yet break the spirit of the law. And so Jesus says we need to get back to what these laws were really about in the beginning. And it was about honoring our relationship with God and our relationships with other people. And you can't separate the two. So, yes, it's good to not work on the Sabbath because God made that day for our enjoyment, to rest, but more importantly, to enjoy the life God has given to us. But if you see somebody hurting on the side of the road, that's okay. It's not only okay, it's the right thing to do to help them on the Sabbath, right? Because those laws were meant to help us in our relationship with our God and relationships with one another. And walking by, just passing somebody by when they're hurting on the side of the road, that's not okay. That hurts relationship. Does this make sense? So, and Jesus says again and again, I did not come to abolish the law. Like that's a pretty common thing for Jesus to say in the Gospels. What he came to do was to tell us what these laws were really about. And that's why he gives us the two great commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And Jesus says you can't do one without doing the other. You cannot love God and hate your neighbor. It does not work. And this is what the prophets railed against too, throughout the Old Testament. Folks keeping the letter of the law and neglecting the poor and ignoring the suffering of those who are hurting. Yeah. So that's the 10 Commandments. Anyone have any last words on that?
I just thank you for going through it. I got a lot of insight in it, and just it's been crazy. And I apologize that I'm still taking phone calls and stuff while you're doing it.
That's okay.
But I really enjoyed the way you stepped through it. I was just thinking about how growing up, I think my computer froze. Oh, there, I'm back. Just thinking about growing up and being taught you don't hate anybody, that hate is not a word that should be in our language. And if I said to my mom, I hate them, and she, no, we don't hate anybody. You can dislike their actions or something they say, but you don't hate anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I really appreciate about the 10 Commandments, especially reinterpreted through the lens of Jesus, is that loving our neighbor has become a part of a good relationship with God. And so people of faith throughout the centuries have tried at times to say that all we have to do is honor God, and that's what God wants from us. So I'm thinking of particular of those grand cathedrals in Europe that were built on the backs of the poor. They're beautiful buildings, but in the life of the church, they gathered money and wealth to build these grand buildings, all the while the poor were suffering. And I think Jesus would have said that that's not okay. And so this is one of the reasons why most Protestant buildings are very simple compared to the grand cathedrals of long ago. If you go to some churches, they'll have there's like gold everywhere, and I mean it's really ornate. And our tradition, especially the Wesleyan tradition, has found that is contrary to the will of God, like what God wants. is for us to spend our resources caring for those who are poor. Yeah. Good. Well, thank you all for taking the time to explore Exodus today. We will gather together next week, and we'll be looking at the golden calf passage. That's Exodus 32. And I'm excited to talk about this with you all. It's, to me, one of the most fascinating stories in the book of Exodus. And so I'm excited to explore it with you. We're continuing our mixtape series this Sunday. I'll be speaking on the parable of the Good Samaritan, one of my favorite stories from Scripture. Pastor Glenn is preaching next week. And I'll share with you all. I have teamed up with a group of pastors who are my friends from across the Pacific Northwest, some of the best preachers in the conference. And we're going to be sharing sermons with each other over the summer, all sharing our favorite Bible passages. So we'll get to hear from some really great preachers this summer. That will let me take a little break and kind of rest and renew after this crazy spring. But it will also be good to hear some other voices. So I'm really excited about that. So, yeah. Liana, did you have something? You're unmuted, so I just wanted to let you speak if you had something.
I have to go and pick up my son, take him to lunch, and I told him I'd leave about noon. So
Okay.
He'll get angry and start calling here in a minute.
All right. Well, then let's wrap up. Good to see you all, and we'll see you next week.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.